When you think about nuclear energy, what comes to mind? It wouldn't surprise me if it were the catastrophic events of Chernobyl or Fukushima, in which nuclear reactors had major negative impacts on their surrounding environments. But what if I told you that 20% of the electricity produced in the US currently comes from nuclear? So if you're in the US, then there's a chance your electricity is being produced from a nuclear reactor somewhere right now. There has been a few major events that led to the perception of nuclear being dangerous. However, nuclear is actually one of the safest ways known to generate carbon-free electricity. Nuclear actually has less deaths per terawatt hour produced than coal, oil, biomass, and gas, by a large margin. The reality is that nuclear, in most cases, is one of the cleanest, safest, and most reliable ways for humans to produce electricity. Yet the world seems like it has forgotten about this amazing technology. In today's video, I want to discuss my research on nuclear technology, as I think it could be one of the most important, beneficial, and misunderstood technologies out there. Now, the reason I became so curious about nuclear is because I always thought nuclear could be a way to solve many of our energy needs, while at the same time fighting climate change. After I read Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, I became convinced that nuclear will play a large role in helping humans achieve carbon neutrality. I also concluded that nuclear is going to play a larger role than most people anticipate right now. On top of this, recently the US government pledged $46 billion to advance nuclear and nuclear fuel research in Joe Biden's Renewable Energy Infrastructure Plan, which has the goal of reducing the United States carbon emissions from electricity generation to zero by 2035. It looks like part of this initiative is now investing in nuclear technology as a source of clean and reliable power. So it looks like the US is starting to come to the same conclusions that I am. The World Nuclear Association helps explain why the world needs more nuclear power, where it says, "Growth in the world's population and economy, coupled with rapid urbanization, will result in a substantial increase in energy demand over the coming years. The United Nations estimates that the world's population will grow from 7.6 billion in 2017 to about 9.7 billion in 2050. So the global projections are predicting that the world population will grow by about 26% by 2050. However, our global energy usage is projected to grow by 50% over that same time frame. This is because more and more people are being lifted out of poverty and gaining access to developed economies, which produce more electricity. Also, as global warming continues, air conditioning is projected to be one of the key drivers of global electricity demand growth. So global warming is kind of creating a negative feedback loop right now, because as the world gets hotter, we need more energy to cool ourselves down. And if we don't move away from fossil fuels, then producing this energy will lead to even more greenhouse gases produced. To put this simply, our world is projected to see a massive increase in electricity demand over the next 30 years, at the same time as we are trying to restructure our grids to make them carbon neutral. But we can just use solar panels and wind power to produce all of this clean energy, right? Well, not quite. There is this tricky thing called the duck curve, which is the problem caused by inconsistent electricity demand throughout the day. Or in other words, us humans like to use different levels of electricity at different points in the day. This chart right here shows the duck curve on both summer and winter days. In the summer, we can see that the peak load is right around 5 to 6 in the afternoon, and in winter, it looks like the peak load is around 8 in the afternoon. The problem with the duck curve is that the peaks are during periods where renewable energy isn't at its most efficient. I mean, up here in Canada during the winters, the sun sets around 5 p.m. And again, we can see that the peak hours in the winter times are around 8 p.m. when the sun is no longer shining and the winds may not be blowing. What this means is that the inconsistent nature of solar and wind do not line up with our inconsistent power demand. And there's absolutely no way that I would trust solar panels or wind to power my home in the dead of a Canadian winter. Our sun times and the angle of the sun this far north in the winters just means not much solar energy. There's actually an article from one of the major news outlets that says solar energy doesn't work in the Yukon winters until February. They also have this chart that shows solar becomes pretty ineffective from about October to February this far north. So solar alone powering the grid up here just won't work. Now yes, there is an argument for storing the electricity in batteries and using this power during off-peak hours. But if solar and wind cannot produce enough energy during the day, then there won't be excess energy to store at night in batteries. I just don't think solar, wind, and energy storage is going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. It may work in certain areas around the world, or maybe even in the majority of areas around the world, but it's not going to be our solution everywhere. Also, the base load electricity, which is this level right here, is the level of electricity we need to have throughout the entire day. It's the base amount of energy we need to produce consistently, all day, 24/7. Currently, our base loads are mostly produced from natural gas or coal plants because they're very consistent and reliable. So what we need to do is find a way to decarbonize this massive base load as well, with something that produces very reliable and consistent electricity. On top of all of this, the world is moving towards making all vehicles electric. Canada actually just announced that it's going to ban sales of new fuel-powered cars by 2035, and other countries around the world are following suit. This means that all new cars from 2035 and onward will be electric vehicles, which means that all of the energy we are currently getting from burning gas in our vehicles will have to be added to the electricity grid, and ultimately our electricity production. This is what the Nuclear Association has to say about electric vehicles and how it could affect our electricity demand throughout the day. Future widespread use of electric vehicles, both pure electric and plug-in hybrids, will increase electricity demand modestly, perhaps up to 15% in terms of kilowatt hours. But this increase will mostly come overnight, in off-peak demand, so will not significantly increase systems' peak capacity requirements in gigawatts. Overnight charging of vehicles will, however, greatly increase the proportion of that system capacity to be converted by baseload power generation, either nuclear or coal. In a typical system, this might increase by about 50 to 60% to 70 to 80% of the total as shown in the figures below. They then provide these two charts right here which showcase what they're saying. Since electric vehicles will be charged at home, most likely overnight, it means that electric vehicles shouldn't increase our electricity usage during peak hours. Instead, they'll increase our energy usage in off hours, which ultimately means electric vehicles will increase our base load. Now remember, our base load is currently handled mostly by coal or natural gas, which are reliable sources of power. So basically, this increased base load electricity demand will need to be filled with something reliable and clean, and that something should be nuclear. What I am saying is that I believe nuclear energy could be used as a carbon-free electricity source in areas of the world where other renewable energies won't work, and as a way to decarbonize our base load electricity needs throughout the day, since our base load needs to be consistent and reliable. On page 24 of Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, which I referenced earlier on in the video, he has this to say about nuclear. Nuclear fission. Here's a one-sentence case for nuclear power. It's the only carbon-free energy source that can reliably deliver power day and night through every season, almost anywhere on Earth, that has been proven to work on a large scale. No other clean energy source even comes close to what nuclear already provides today. And it's hard to foresee a future where we decarbonize our power grid affordably without using more nuclear power. In 2018, researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology analyzed nearly 1,000 scenarios for getting to zero in the United States. All the cheapest paths involved using a power source that's clean and always available. That is, one like nuclear power. Without a source like that, getting to carbon zero electricity would cost a lot more. Nuclear plants are also number one when it comes to efficiently using materials like cement, steel, and glass. This chart right here shows you how much material it takes to generate 1 unit of electricity from various sources. The book then goes on to show this graph, which shows how much material it takes to produce 1 terawatt hour of energy. We can clearly see that solar, hydro, wind, and geothermal take quite a bit of materials to produce 1 terawatt. And look at where nuclear is on this chart. It's below coal and above natural gas. From this chart, we can clearly see that nuclear takes much less materials to produce the same amount of energy as other renewable sources. I also don't think that this chart accounts for the materials needed in energy storage that would be associated with making solar or wind more reliable. What's interesting to me is that despite all of the benefits that nuclear has, the projections currently show that nuclear isn't going to see that much growth from now to 2050. They show that other renewable sources like solar and wind are going to see much more growth. So why is the world not investing more into nuclear power with all of its benefits? And why are we focusing so much on other renewables like wind and solar? Well, on the next page of Bill Gates' book, he addresses this where he says, "It's no secret that nuclear power has its problems. It's very expensive to build today. Human error can cause accidents. Uranium, the fuel it uses, can be converted for use in weapons. The waste is dangerous and hard to store. High-profile accidents like the 3 Mile Island in the United States Chernobyl in the former USSR, and Fukushima in Japan put a spotlight on all these risks. There are real-world problems that led to those disasters, but instead of getting to work on solving those problems, we just stopped trying to advance the field. Basically, what Bill Gates is saying is that nuclear does have its issues, but instead of solving these issues and investing in fixing them, the world kind of just stopped nuclear research altogether. What's interesting though is despite the major failures in nuclear like Chernobyl and Fukushima, nuclear still has killed far less people than any other fossil fuel. This goes back to the chart I showed at the beginning of the video, and how nuclear still has less deaths than coal and oil. Nuclear actually kills less people than cars, but we don't see the world trying to stop us all from driving. I personally believe that the world is not investing in nuclear because these facts are not promoted to the public. And when events like Chernobyl happen, it's a pretty catastrophic event that has a tangible, lasting effect that humans can point to. But it all goes back to the problem that society is not investing in solving these problems, which I think we should be. Now, say what you will about Bill Gates, because I know he's a pretty controversial figure, but the guy is investing his own money in solving these problems with nuclear, and trying to advance this field. His company, Terrapower, has actually created a nuclear reactor that can solve many, if not all, of the issues nuclear currently faces. For example, Terrapower reactors can run on waste produced from the reactors we currently use, which would help solve our radioactive waste issue entirely, and dispose of material that can make nuclear weapons. This would also mean that for a period of time, we would be able to power these new reactors with material we already have laying around, which ultimately means we could lower the amount of uranium we would need to mine in the future. These reactors are fully automated as well, which means the events of Chernobyl and Fukushima would never happen again, as they were directly linked to human error. On top of all of this, the design of his reactor uses the laws of physics to slow down the nuclear reaction if the reactor starts getting too hot. This means the reactor has a built-in safety mechanism that would essentially shut itself down if an overheating event were to occur, and this safety mechanism is driven directly by the laws of physics. You see, the problem is we haven't really advanced nuclear plant technology or modernized it, and that's what we need to do. Terrapower is now working with the US government to make their reactor a reality and build the first prototype. I think that this is where some of that $46 billion that the US wants to spend on advancing nuclear technology will go, and I think that this investment is much needed. An example of this was recently on June 7th. Terrapower actually announced that they're starting construction on one of their prototype reactors in Wyoming. So it looks like the US is planning on building out more of these advanced reactors and developing this technology. However, there are still some major blockers for the mass adoption of nuclear energy, which are the cost to build it and its scalability. This chart right here shows the capital cost range per kilowatt of different energy sources, including their long-term fuel and operating expenses. And on this chart, we can see that nuclear can be the most costly form of energy, and even on its low end, it's not nearly as cheap as solar or wind. In some cases, it can actually be 10 times as expensive. On top of this, the average time to build one nuclear reactor in 2019 was 117 months. That's nearly a decade to build one reactor. In comparison, the Phoebe solar project in Texas has 250 megawatts of capacity and was completed in just 9 months. This chart right here actually shows the rate at which we can build solar versus nuclear right now, and how the sheer rate of solar production can yield more potential electricity generation than nuclear. The chart doesn't account for one major factor though, and that's that the nuclear reactor will be running at close to 100% efficiency all of the time once it's operational, whereas the solar power will only produce its maximum amount of energy about 20% of the time. To put this in perspective and in real world terms, this one nuclear reactor could produce enough electricity for 1.75 million homes, whereas all of this solar power could only produce enough electricity for about 500,000 homes. So we would actually need to produce more than 3 times as much solar than this chart shows to make up for just this one nuclear reactor. When we account for this, the math works out to the solar being about half as cost effective as nuclear, but it's still less expensive and can come online in increments opposed to nuclear producing no clean energy for about a decade. However, another source, which actually comes from the World Nuclear Organization, makes a very compelling argument here when they say, it is noteworthy that in the 1980s, 218 power reactors started up, an average of one every 17 days. These included 47 in the USA, 42 in France, and 18 in Japan. The average power was 923.5 megawatts, so it's not hard to imagine a similar number being commissioned in a decade after about 2015. Basically, what the source is saying is that if we go hard on construction on many nuclear reactors right now, like if we just start building right now, then on average, we can build a reactor in nearly 2 weeks, just like we did in the 1980s. There's actually one country that made a huge bet on nuclear in the late 1900s. This country is France, and they generate about 70% of their electricity from nuclear energy already. To put this in perspective, France is second in the world for the number of operating nuclear reactors, sitting at 56 currently. The only country in the world with more reactors is the US, and France has about 1/5 of the US population. France actually produces more energy from nuclear than they do from oil, so this country is seriously invested in nuclear, more so than any other nation on the planet. France also has only 4% of their primary energy supply coming from coal, which is well below the 34% average of the G20 countries. Remember earlier on in the video when I was saying that coal plants are currently being used for the base load in our electricity grids? Well, France is a clear example of a country that has phased out coal and replaced it with nuclear. This chart is proof that it can be done. If we also take a look at France's per capita CO2 emissions, then we can see that it has been declining massively since its peak in the 1980s. France's CO2 emissions per capita are actually back to where they were in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago. That is absolutely incredible. Like, good job, France. If we take a look at France's CO2 by emission type, we can see that their coal emissions peaked right around the 1980s, right when France's CO2 per capita also peaked. And since the 1980s, we can see that coal has been steadily coming down and being phased out. The 1980s are when France's nuclear reactors all started coming online, and these reactors are still operational today, which is directly related to France's coal and CO2 per capita peaking in the 1980s. On top of this, the World Nuclear Association says that French retail electricity prices without major effects from feed-in tariffs for wind and solar remain low. In the second half of 2019, household consumers in France paid just under 90% of the average electricity price of the EU 27. So, France's electricity prices are actually lower than the average in the EU, despite the higher cost to build nuclear reactors. And further down it also says, in December 2017, the French president stated that nuclear is the most carbon-free way to produce electricity with renewables. So clearly, France loves their nuclear, and they say it's the best way to produce electricity with renewable energy. However, surprisingly, despite all of this, France actually put a policy in place to reduce their reliance on nuclear energy by 2035. To generate only 50% of the country's electricity. Now, from my research and from what I can tell, the reason for this is because they want to diversify their energy sources in case something negative ever happens to the nuclear industry in the future. I do not believe that they are doing this due to any negative reason with nuclear reactor technology currently. Now, let's take a look at how France has been handling their nuclear waste, and if this has created any issues for the country over the past 40 years. This article right here from the International Atomic Energy Agency says, to manage the nearly 1,150 tons of spent fuel it produces every year, France, like several other countries, decided early on to close its national nuclear fuel cycle by recycling or reprocessing spent fuel. In doing so, the French nuclear industry can recover uranium and plutonium from the used fuel for reuse, thereby also reducing the volume of high-level waste. Further down it also says, since the start of operations in the mid-1960s, the La Hague plant has safely processed over 23,000 tons of spent fuel, enough to power France's nuclear fleet for 14 years. So, France recycles a large portion of its nuclear waste and reuses it in their reactors. However, not 100% of the fuel can be recycled, which means that there is some radioactive waste that still has to be disposed of. What France does is stores this radioactive material far underground, and it has had no problems with storing this material over the past 4 decades. However, I do think that if the entire world was running off nuclear currently, then the story would be a little bit different. But so far, France hasn't had any issues. The French ambassador also came out on June 3rd of this year and said French technologies can solve the nuclear waste problem. If we also remember that there is funding in new advanced nuclear reactors that can run off the world's current waste, then I think the future of nuclear can solve the waste issue entirely. It all really comes back to nuclear needing more research, development, and funding to continue advancing the technology in the sector and tackling all of its current issues. But I do believe that France provides an awesome case study for how important nuclear could be in our future carbon-free economies, and I think the success of nuclear in their country is incredibly promising, especially as the world invests into advancing nuclear reactor technology. In conclusion, I think nuclear has its role to play in the future of decarbonizing our electricity generation, and I am very optimistic about the future of this sector. I also believe that the current projections on nuclear are not reflecting the reality of what will come, as I do believe that as time passes and advancements are made in nuclear technology, that nuclear will play a much more important role in our economies. I think the public perspective on nuclear is shaped by a few catastrophic events that are avoidable with modernized technology, and I believe that as climate change continues, more and more efforts will be made to modernize this industry and change the public opinion on nuclear. Without a doubt, I believe that nuclear is one of the most important technologies we currently possess, and after doing all of my research, I believe nuclear will be a necessity for governments around the world to meet their carbon targets by 2050. However, I do not believe that nuclear will be the only renewable energy technology, and I do believe that solar and wind have massive roles to play in our renewable future. Nuclear just seems to be the most suitable option for supplying our baseload needs with clean electricity, while solar and wind could help beef up the grid when we need more energy during our peak hours. They all have their roles to play, and I think nuclear's role in our future will be more significant than the world currently perceives. Not because nuclear is an option, but because it is a necessity. Alright, and that's pretty much going to wrap up the video, everyone, but I would love to hear all of your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Do you all think that nuclear is going to be a massive industry in the future that's going to help us fight climate change, or is it just going to be another bust industry? And if you enjoyed this video or you found it helpful in some way, then please remember to leave a like on it. It really helps out my channel, and if you want to stick around and see more content like this, then please consider subscribing as well. But with all of that being said, thank you all again so much for watching. And if you made it to the end of the video and you watched the entire video, then God bless you. Seriously, nothing helps out my channel more than you guys watching the entire video. So I really appreciate it, and I really hope to see you all again in my next one.